Okay, next a bit of the economic geography, and some of this should sound familiar because we've in the past discussed the Asian tigers. Again, strong, industrialized, export-oriented countries. And most of them are in East Asia. We've talked about South Korea with state capitalism, Taiwan, the wayward province of China, Hong Kong, which is now a special administrative region of China. And the fourth one we didn't discuss so much is down here, which is that tiny island state of Singapore. And Singapore, being quite small, what's really important about Singapore is where it's located. It's located right along shipping channels between South Asia and East Asia. And all around Singapore, we also have these new Asian tigers. And these are countries that, because the land is pretty much limited in Singapore, but it has extremely strong connections to the outside world, its wealth is sort of spread into these neighboring regions where Singapore is now sort of the office location, and these are the places where the actual things are being produced. And we can also include Vietnam in this as well, because Vietnam is far enough along economically that it could properly be considered one of these new tigers as well. So in places like Thailand, for example, there's, computer parts are manufactured. A number of goods are manufactured in this region that kind of surrounds Singapore. Now, what's important about Singapore is that Singapore is a break of bulk point, something we've talked about in the past. Singapore is a port. This is some pictures of the port facility in Singapore. This is a place where goods have to be transferred from one mode of transportation to the other. Things come in from ships. It has a busy airport. It has land connections to Asia, and goods are moved around. Singapore is one of the most important port facilities in the world because of its location in between East Asia and South Asia. So it's right in the middle of sea transportation worldwide. Now, one thing that's changed from about 10 years ago or from 2000 to 2012, is that in the past, we're going to look at, so the 2000 is let's start with the green. In the past, most of the goods produced in Southeast Asia made their way to the United States or to Japan. Likewise, most of the goods that came in were from Japan and maybe a little bit from China. Okay, now we're going to look at the brown, kind of orangish color arrows. This is what's happening more recently. More recently, the goods, rather than going to the United States, are increasingly going to Japan, and likewise, the short of this is that the goods have been going to China and coming in from China. The short of this is that China is becoming as China's economy has grown, it has become a more important trading partner to Southeast Asia than the United States. That they're kind of taking away a lot of our business, really. Another issue in Southeast Asia is who controls what part of the ocean, because especially in this insular part where you have the island countries and you have ocean in between them, there's issues of who controls what. And I'm not going to dwell on this because there's actually a better video that explains this, but really quickly, you have a territorial sea, the area just along your coast that you control, and there's also the concept of high seas, that international waters that nobody really controls. And where your country's stuff starts and the international stuff starts has changed over time. During the colonial era, the territorial seas were pretty small because there was more of an emphasis on shipping lanes. But the United States kind of opened a can of worms in the 1940s by trying to claim all of its continental shelf. So if you look at a continent, the continents don't magically end at the water's edge. They continue under the water for some extent before you drop into deep ocean. And so the United States wanted to control a bigger piece of its territory underneath the water off of its coast. Actually, because there's resources like oil, for example. So to try to make sense of this on a worldwide basis, there was what's called the law of the sea, that gave countries a 12-mile territorial sea that is exclusively their territory, but also a 200-mile what's called an EEZ, or exclusive economic zone. And what that means is that, according to the United Nations, that countries should have 200 miles that is exclusively for them to exploit for fishing and oil and things of that nature. Now, China is not playing along with this. China, rather than sticking to that 200-mile boundary, has issued a very vague map called the 9-dash line map. So these are the 9 dashes. And what China is saying is that, according to China, that it controls more than that 200 miles, that China has rights to control the entire South China Sea. Now, this is in conflict with United Nations agreements. So if you see all these overlapping lines, these are lines where this is what Vietnam should control, this is what the Philippines control, and these are all in conflict with the 9-dash line. I'm going to include a video that explains in a bit better detail, but to enforce this 9-dash line, one thing China is doing is it's starting to build islands within that South China Sea and making miniature military bases that are capable of offensive and defensive fighting, radar stations, things for jet fighters. So it's actually, in these islands here, it's actually setting up, like the Spratlys, for example, it's actually establishing little military bases to try to enforce its claim in the South China Sea.